All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Chris Avery, and I am on the National Climate Assessment Team here at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to the note in the chat box that will be coming here momentarily that will note that audio is disabled for all participants. But if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them into the chat. We will use the chat function to handle question and answers throughout this webinar process. If you have any technical difficulties, please enter them in. Please contact Tia Biggs or Eliza Lustig on the panel participation list for technical support today. Please also note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate toward others per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. Next slide. I'll kick off our webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Energy chapter authors. Next slide. For those of you unfamiliar with us, the U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to, quote, assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change, end quote. The program convenes 14, now 15 as of yesterday, agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide. The same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment, which we call now the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and informal and informal education. Next slide. The NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They are charged with synthesizing that information, examining the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluating uncertainties. NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive and does not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process involves extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Next slide. So now let's take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview, which is followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. And then there are national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although response actions are discussed throughout the entire report. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features on compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. And we also have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. So now that we've gone through this introductory background, it's my pleasure to introduce Craig Zamuda, the chapter lead of the Energy chapter, who will lead us through the remainder of the webinar today. Thank you, Craig. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. And thank you and Allison Crimmins for your phenomenal leadership and support in terms of managing the overall national climate assessment process. As Chris indicated, my name is Craig Zamuda. I'm with the U.S. Department of Energy, and I have the honor to serve as the Energy Chapter lead author. I say Energy Chapter. This is really the Chapter 5 of the National Climate Assessment, formerly entitled Energy Supply, Delivery, and Demand. But for shorthand, we'll go with the Energy Chapter. This is one of the many national topics that Chris just identified that comprise the National Climate Assessment. Joining me today are several of the authors that helped contribute to this chapter, not all of them. We had over 11 authors, but I want to at least recognize right up front 4 of those authors who will be speaking with us today when it comes to describing certain figures that we used. That includes Natalie Boisson from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Rebecca Ephraimson from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Tien-Tsin Huang from our Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and Dan Laughlin from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Our plan for this session is to provide you an overview of the chapter. We plan to describe what's new since the last National Climate Assessment. We'll highlight 3 key messages that serve as a framework for the chapter and discuss some of the figures the authors included in the chapter to help illustrate the key messages. And once we've done with that, we'll have time for questions. Let me go to the next slide. As we're moving into a description of, let's stay on this slide just for a moment, because I do really want to focus for folks that have tracked the national climate assessments, past national climate assessment. What's new and different about this chapter? First, let me note that since the last NCA, there is growing evidence that the nation's energy system is changing rapidly and significantly. This is including the decreasing cost of solar and wind technologies, solar by roughly 90%, wind by 70%, battery storage by 85%, so significant reductions in the cost of these technologies, and it's leading to the accelerating deployment of renewable energy technologies across the country. We're also seeing the adoption of electric vehicles. We're seeing the ongoing transition away from fossil fuels and the increasing interdependency between the energy system and the other key sectors, such as transportation and communication. Not only is the energy system changing, but the environment in which the energy system must operate is also changing rapidly with the increased frequency, intensity, and duration of climate change and extreme weather events. This is resulting in increasing outages, damages, and costs to society. In the last decade alone, power outages have increased by over 65%. So we see this trend that's growing since even the last National Climate Assessment. Second, our ability to monitor these changes is improving. We're observing impacts on what seems a daily basis. Every time you turn around and look at the paper, you're seeing one more example of the impacts of extreme weather on society, on the energy system, et cetera. In addition, our ability to project future impacts through modeling, more sophisticated modeling technologies, modeling of climate change and extreme weather is improving. Third is a growing awareness of the disproportionate impact of climate change on society, with the overburdened and low-income communities generally being the first to lose power and the last to regain it. Since the last National Climate Assessment, we have a greater understanding for the need to consider energy justice and equity and the consequences of not doing so. Fourth is the recognition of the increasing pace of not only developing response plans, but more importantly, of making the investments and making those investments at the national, regional, state, local, and tribal levels. to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that is mitigation, but also to adapt to climate change impacts. It's increasingly evident and encouraging that we know how to do this. However, there's also growing evidence that we will need to accelerate the pace, the scale, and the scope of these types of activities to meet the climate challenge and to move from incremental change to transformative change. Before moving forward, I should note that the role of the energy system in contributing to climate change, as well as the actions being taken to address the risks, are not only discussed in the energy chapter, but also in a number of the other chapters that Chris referred to earlier, including the national chapters, the regional chapters, as well as the response chapters focusing on mitigation and adaptation. We've collaborated with these other chapters in the development of the National Climate Assessment and tried to point the reader to those other chapters where appropriate. One additional point for us to keep in mind is the critical role that the energy system plays in our lives and the need for reliable and affordable energy. We can see this on a daily basis, not just for keeping the lights on and for providing heat or cooling, but also for communication, including charging your cell phones and powering your computers for this webinar, including for transportation, including powering the planes, trains, and automobiles, regardless if they're fueled by fossil fuels or electricity. For health and safety, including for healthcare facilities and hospitals, and for water supplies, including water treatment and delivery, as well as for irrigation of crops. All these sectors and others contained in the National Climate Assessment are dependent upon a resilient, clean, affordable, and reliable energy system. The author team framed the findings of this chapter into three key messages. If we go to the next slide, please. Our first key message is climate change threatens the energy system. So not only is climate change, is the energy system contributing to climate change, it is also impacted by climate change. Today's energy system that we're so dependent upon was built largely in the last century. It is aging and was not designed to optimally operate under a different set of environmental conditions than we are now experiencing with climate change, and that we will experience in the future. And at the same time, society is ever more dependent upon reliable and clean energy supplies. Every day, we're seeing the impacts of climate change and extreme weather. We note this, the different examples in the report, and we're seeing those impacts increase in frequency, intensity, and duration. Just as an example, in the Southwest, the chapter talks about events taking place in California, and now more recently in Hawaii, where we're seeing how droughts and wildfires are impacting health and safety, damaging communities, reducing power generation, and impacting utilities that provide our electricity, and in some recent cases, potentially bankrupting utilities. We're witnessing how sea level rise and more intense hurricanes are causing floods and damage to coastal energy infrastructure, including generation facilities, transmission and distribution assets, and impacting oil and gas production and refining, both onshore and offshore. We're also seeing extreme temperatures, both hot and cold extreme temperatures across the country. The extreme temperatures can result in increasing energy demand, often at times coinciding with reduced supply due to impacts on fuel supply and generation. We experienced this in Texas with extreme cold events and the impacts on communities due to not having winterized the energy system. In other regions of the country, we're seeing situations in which heat extremes are occurring, such as in the Pacific Northwest, an area that typically has not deployed air conditioning, but is now because of these higher temperatures. We're witnessing how the impacts of extreme weather are occurring across all regions and all components of the energy system, from generation to distribution to energy demand. And the chapter does a fine job of kind of providing illustrative examples of these trends that we're seeing. Without mitigation, without adaptation, projected increases in the frequency, intensity, and duration and variability of extreme events will amplify the effects on the energy system that are described in the chapter, as well as the cascading impacts on other sectors that will affect all communities across the country. Next slide, please. Our second key message is compounding factors affect energy system and community vulnerabilities. What do we mean by compounding factors? We're referring to changes that are occurring in energy technologies, policies, and markets, in addition to their interconnections and the potential benefits, as well as the potential unintended consequences of these factors. In some cases, these changes can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they can also have unintended consequences to communities by also increasing vulnerabilities of energy systems to climate change and extreme weather. And I'll give you an example. The shifts from fossil fuels, such as coal and natural gas, to more variable energy resources, such as wind and solar. This introduces new challenges in terms of maintaining adequate electricity supply on a 24-hour-a-day basis. The transition to greater use of electricity for heating and cooling and transportation, which is electric vehicles, can result in increased demand and result in supply challenges. Increasing automation can provide additional opportunities for utilities to better manage the system, to identify power outages, isolate outages, and target recovery efforts. But automation can also pose increased risk from cyber threats. Global and national supply chain disruptions from pandemics, such as the COVID, and other causes can affect the energy system and the availability of key equipment, such as transformers or batteries for backup power, electric vehicles. The increased frequency of extreme weather events can result in battered and vulnerable communities facing the latest threat without having fully recovered from a prior event, further exacerbating the risks. All these factors and others described in the chapter can potentially increase vulnerabilities compounded by climate change. Go to the next slide, please. Our third and final key message recognizes that the nation is responding to a changing climate, but will need to increase the pace, scale, and scope of current efforts. The chapter discusses efforts that are already underway to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance energy system resilience, and identifies a number of opportunities to build upon progress. We give examples of work that's already going on and outline what else could take place. Some of these identified opportunities in the chapter for investments include improvements in energy efficient buildings, including grid interactive efficiency buildings. It talks about technology to decarbonize the energy system, talk about advances in automation and communication and artificial intelligence technologies to optimize operations, opportunities to improve climate modeling and planning methodologies, to identify not only projecting climate impacts, but to identify cost-effective resilience investments to really help us make the case for the return on investment associated with taking these preventative actions. And it talks to efforts and opportunities to increase equitable access to clean energy for all of society, including overburdened and low-income communities. At this point, I'd like to expand the discussion and bring in several of the other chapter authors to discuss the figures that we use to help describe the impacts of climate change and the actions that are being taken to mitigate and adapt. Go to the next slide. I'll take the lead for this first figure that illustrates how climate change impacts the components in the energy system. I talked a little bit about this already, but let me help describe this figure and kind of how it can be helpful in terms of understanding the various components of the energy system, whether it's resource extraction and processing, energy transport and storage, electricity generation, or energy end use, and illustrate the range of impacts that we're experiencing from climate change. It's a fairly complicated figure, but it really attempts to list a range of impacts for various components. For example, in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a bubble entitled thermoelectric power. Beneath that are several examples of impacts, including impacts from flooding, higher temperatures, and limited water availability. You can see from this figure the potential implications across the energy system from extreme temperatures, droughts and floods, sea level rise, wildfires, A couple points worth noting is that a large number of the energy system components are dependent upon significant supplies of water, water for bioenergy crops, water for generating electricity, regardless if it's from hydropower, fossil or nuclear fueled, for oil and gas production and refining. Plus, droughts can have a significant impact. Temperature is also important, both air and water temperatures. Higher air temperatures can reduce the efficiency of electricity generation, also the transmission and distribution of electrons, while also increasing electricity demand for cooling. Higher water temperatures can result in the temporary shutdown of power plants. Higher air temperatures can impede access to oil and gas fields and impact pipelines in Alaska due to thawing permafrost. But these higher air water temperatures in Alaska can also reduce Arctic sea ice and benefit offshore production and shipping of petroleum products. Extreme wind events can impact offshore oil and gas production as well as onshore power lines. You've often seen pictures of the downed power lines after extreme wind events, resulting in power outages for communities and businesses. The impact of climate change and extreme weather will vary on a temporal and spatial basis, but will impact the entire energy system across the nation. Let's go to the next slide. For this next figure, let me introduce Natalie Voislin from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. She'll describe our figure that characterizes projected changes in electricity demand over this century. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Greg. So I'm following here, and we're going to deep dive on the overall impact of climate on the projected change in electricity demand. It is important because it's the projections of electricity demand that are motivating how many generation resources we need. We are looking here at the projection of changes in annual electricity demand for the midterm, so on the left, from 2020 to 2050, and to the left to long term, to the end of the century. Those projections are under the assumptions of the most severe climate change impact on temperature, with the understanding that temperature is not the sole drivers of those changes in electricity demand. Those projections are based on socioeconomics and adaptation scenarios, including changes in populations. Those projections do not reflect the complete provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act at this time. What you can see on the figures are that we are projecting increases in electricity demand of 25 to 70% in the midterm by 2050, and then from 96 to over 250% by the end of the century across the country. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough high-resolution climate information for Alaska, Hawaii, and other Pacific islands. So this is why here we're just focusing on the continental US. Overall, what this figure shows is that the energy demand is projected to increase through 2050, driven by the warming temperature, increased electrification, and economic growth. There are regional variations across those regions. Those increases are associated with the ongoing adoption of electric vehicles, heat pumps, and water heaters. When you could look into the long term, you see more nuances across states. In the long term, we are looking at increases in electricity demand associated with the decarbonization goals and the associated electrification of transportation, industry, and buildings. Those trends also alter the peak demand patterns and include enhanced sensitivity to temperature extremes. So again, this figure is important really because it's the increase in demand that drives the increase in the generation resources that we need. And I will pass it to the next slide.
Great, thank you. Let's move to the next slide, and Rebecca Ephraimson from Oak Ridge National Laboratory will talk to this slide. Rebecca?
Yes, hello. So as the first two chapters of the report show, Temperature trends and shifting precipitation patterns can coincide with or contribute to extreme events. Those trends and events pose joint hazards to energy systems and local communities. So in the figure, you see that heat waves increase cooling demand and can impact electricity transmission systems. Droughts at the same time can reduce generation of electricity, for example, from hydropower. Under droughts, vegetation can become stressed. You may have more insect outbreaks. And so there is tree mortality, with trees falling on power lines and combining with drought to increase wildfire risk. Wildfire and drought can combine to reduce forest cover, which affects landscape stability and power systems. This is just one example of cascading effects of climate change on energy systems. Moving beyond the figure, even when climate-related stressors are sequential rather than concurrent, there can be issues. For example, overburdened communities near Houston, Texas were adversely affected by the 2021 winter storm before they had recovered from Hurricane Harvey 4 years earlier. Added to these risks from climate change are risks to the energy system from cyber attacks, which can target a system when it is most vulnerable. And as Craig mentioned, disruptions to power supply and delivery can cause cascading effects in other sectors like water, health, and transportation. And in addition to the energy chapter, you can read about some of these hazards in the Focus on Wildfires section and the Focus on Compound Events section. Thank you.
The next slide, please. So this is figure 5.4 from the chapter, and I'm going to speak to this particular slide. It identifies a number of the potential energy resilient solutions that are being deployed across the nation. It's really a companion to that first slide that I showed a moment ago that talked about what all the vulnerabilities are to the system. So these are kind of companion slides, if you will. The slide is testimony that there are actions that can be taken today. We don't need to wait for future research and deployment. We can do these today. They include examples of using less water-intensive generation technologies and bioenergy crops, talking about hardening the energy infrastructure by elevating or undergrounding energy assets or moving out of the risk zones, talk about transitioning to clean energy technologies, including distributed energy resources, coupled with storage and microgrids, so that not only we can reduce emissions, but we can provide backup power in the event power goes down. Talking about the need for not only developing, but enforcing building codes to promote energy efficiency and reduce energy demand. So I won't go through all of these, but it really kind of lays out the landscape of solutions that are available today to address the problems we're encountering today. I would also say part of the challenge here is not just the availability of the technologies, but to make the business case for these investments. So we need to do a better job, and the chapter talks to this, about characterizing what are the monetary benefits of resilience investments, so that when communities, when the federal government, state, local governments, when tribes are looking at taking a more preventative approach, not only can they be looking at these solutions, but we can adequately characterize the return on investment associated with their deployment. Let me now turn to Tien-Tsin Huang from our Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory to discuss our grid interactive efficient building slide.
Thanks, Craig. The buildings sector consumes about 40% of U.S. primary energy and contributes to 29% of the greenhouse gas emission. Climate change influences buildings in multiple ways. First, the warming effect increases cooling loads and decreases heating loads of buildings. Secondly, more buildings will need air conditioning during summer. Thirdly, the more frequent or severe extreme weather events, such as heat wave or cold snap, coincident with grid power interruptions, increase health risk of occupants due to exposure to indoor height or low temperature and humidity. On the other hand, buildings are changing. the energy demand becomes more dynamic due to more use of heat pump technologies to provide heating, ventilation, and air conditioning services, and hot water, charging and discharging electric battery, as well as charging of electric vehicles. The building sector offers a great opportunity to mitigate effects of climate change. This figure, adopted from Guidehouse, illustrates the concept of grid interactive efficient buildings, which integrate energy efficiency technologies to reduce energy demand. On-site renewable energy from, for example, rooftop PV to provide renewable generation on-site, electric vehicles, as well as electricity storage. The smart sensing of weather and occupancy, the two-way communication between the building energy system and the power grid, and the control optimization through the building automation system enable demand flexibility of buildings in responding to the electricity pricing or carbon signals of the power grid. The buildings can use more electricity when it is clean and cheap, while reducing usage when electricity is dirty or expensive. Such demand flexibility, together with the on-site renewable energy generation and energy storage technologies, can provide power for critical services during power outages, thus improving climate resilience of buildings. So Craig, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Tianjin. So next slide, please. So Dan Laughlin from U.S. Environmental Protection Agency will talk to our slide here on decarbonization. Dan, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Craig. Decarbonization of the energy system is already occurring and it's accelerating. This decarbonization is being driven by policies that have strengthened the markets for clean energy, as well as technological innovations and by falling costs. And on the topic of costs, as Craig mentioned earlier, just over the past decade, the cost of wind power has decreased by 70%, solar power costs have decreased by 90%, and battery costs have decreased by 85%. However, large-scale decarbonization will require a major transformation in the energy system, and that transformation will touch all sectors of the economy. In transportation, buildings, and industry, it will involve transitioning to fuels such as electricity, hydrogen, and biofuels. And producing those fuels will require technologies that are low, zero, and even negative carbon emissions. Other decarbonization options include increasing the use of heat pumps for space heating, water heating, and in industry, making use of what would otherwise be waste heat in industrial applications, greatly expanding stationary storage to support integration of renewables, capturing carbon from smokestacks and possibly directly from the atmosphere, and then storing and putting that carbon to beneficial use. As the U.S. energy system undergoes this transformation, the specific decarbonization measures taken can make us more or less resilient to climate change, and we'll need to plan accordingly. All right, thank you, Craig. Back to you.
Thank you, Dan. And let me bring back for return appearance the next slide and Natalie to talk about electricity past and projected electricity generation in the U.S. So Natalie, welcome.
Thanks. So we talked about advances in technology, and in this assessment, we also addressed their implementation as part of the overall generation mix. The implementation of the different technology is the result of multiple components, such as the cost of technologies, legislation, and public acceptance of the new technology and infrastructure. What you see here on this figure is the projections from the Energy Information Agency, historic and projected U.S. electricity generation resource by technology. Those projections do not reflect the full provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act either. What we see is that our current generation portfolio here in 2023 has seen an increase from the previous years on wind and solar due to the reduction in cost dropping at 70% and 90% respectively for wind and solar. And this increase will continue in the future. We currently see as of today that the wind exceeds solar, but we expect solar to exceed wind in the future. What we also see are decreases in thermoelectric technologies as natural gas, nuclear, and coal. Overall, we see that the grid continues to expand the use of clean energy technologies. This is motivated by recently enacted legislation that increases the deployment rate of low-carbon technologies. Beyond this figure, the decarbonization of the electricity sector is critical to support the decarbonization of the whole economy and needs to come first so that electrification of sectors can be supported. We are doing a lot, but not fast enough. As you can see on the projection for 2050, a greater transformation is needed to meet the goals of 100% clean electricity in 2035 and net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2050. Great.
Thank you. If we go to the next slide. So let me thank our 4 authors that were able to join me today, but let me also acknowledge that this was a real team effort. We had a number of authors that contributed to this, experts in their field and a diversity of expertise and a diversity of organizations represented. We had over 5 national labs. We had over 3 agencies be part of this. And we could really bring in experts on different technologies, et cetera. So thanks to the team for helping develop this chapter. Before we move on to questions, let me simply wrap up our remarks and make the following observation. As a nation, we know how to reduce emissions and to increase resilience. We know how to do this. We've demonstrated that we're already doing it. But as also noted, the pace, scale, and scope needs to increase. This chapter identifies the challenges of climate change, the energy supply, delivery, and demand. Equally important, it illustrates actions that are already being taken at the federal, state, local, tribal, and private sector level that demonstrate we can adapt to the challenge of climate change. We can reduce emissions. We just simply must move in a unison and increase the pace. I hope you found this presentation helpful. I encourage you to review the energy chapter and take advantage of the many citation and nearly 300 citations to kind of help make the points that are made here in greater detail. I encourage you to take a look at that. And finally, look at the related national chapters and the response chapters that address mitigation adaptation. And the regional chapters that really provide a geographical kind of downscale treatment of climate change, addressing not just energy, but the other sectors as well. That concludes our remarks. Chris, I'll turn the floor back to you.
Great. Thank you, Craig, and thank you to the entire chapter team for that excellent presentation.